Good morning. My co-authors and I are grateful to the Heritage Education Network Belize for hosting another exciting exploration into Belizean history, culture, and art. Today we will discuss the historic site of San Pedro Siris, located south of the Yalbak Creek in the Cayo district. We investigate the relationship between imported and locally made ceramic vessels to get a clearer picture of the historic Maya foodways in the late 19th century and the way that these foodways reflect broader relationships with encroaching British colonial structures at the time. What do we mean by foodways? The term encompasses the practices, norms, beliefs, and ingredients entailed in the production and consumption of food that is shared by a specific social group. Foodways are a particularly interesting avenue of research for two reasons. First, everyone eats. Every individual participates in foodways in some capacity, whether they relish in the flavors of or create new variations on tradition. We all produce and or consume food in some way. Second, from an academic perspective, foodways offer a glimpse at the intersection of tradition, society, economy, and even politics. In this way, food and the cultural practices that surround it can tell us about the encounter, interaction, and conflict between multiple traditions in one place. Here, we look at the shape of the San Pedro Maya foodway in the 19th century and how tradition was reproduced and reasserted during a period of violent colonialism in what is now Western Belize. Taking an archaeological perspective, this paper investigates the materials related to the practice of specific food traditions. In the tropical climate of Belize, this rarely includes actual food remains, even from the relatively recent practices of the San Pedro Maya. However, we can look at the remains of farming, cooking, and consumption practices that come together to form the San Pedro Maya foodway. Materials recovered from sites in Western Belize include machetes, pots, bowls, pipes, and bottles, as well as ecological remains like animal bones and pollen records. The majority of the group that Grant Jones would later call the San Pedro Maya have roots in the Yucatan, Mexico. In 1847, the outbreak of the caste war saw violent conflicts between the Criollo and Mestizo leaders of Mexico and the Maya leaders who sought to maintain their own local autonomy. Fleeing the violence, many, including Maya families, sought a new home in what was then British Honduras. The caste war and surrounding tensions created several Maya factions, all differing in their relationship to Mexico. On one hand were the Santa Cruz Maya or Crusob, who were antagonistic to the Mexican government. On the other hand were the Pacificos, centered at Icaiche, allied with the Mexican government. And they played an important role in British Honduras as well, as private British logging interests attempted to place logging camps across the landscape. From the Pacificos, a smaller group branched south, settling the villages of San Pedro Siris, San Jose Yalbak, and Quixiowinik, among others. These were the San Pedro Maya. While there is documentary and linguistic evidence suggesting an earlier occupation of the Yalbak Hills by non-Yucatec speaking Maya groups, the influx of Yucatec Maya as a result of the caste war impacted the ethnic makeup of the region significantly. Once San Pedro Siris and the surrounding settlements of the Yalbak Hills were established in the late 1850s, tensions mounted as borders, land claims, and loyalties were adopted, contested, and redrawn across northern and western British Honduras. The San Pedro break from the Icaiche Pacificos amplified tension between the Pacificos and their Mexican allies with the San Pedro Maya. The British, as well, feuding with Mexico over land rights to the mahogany forest in central British Honduras, appointed San Pedro Maya leaders like Asuncion Eck as alcaldes in an attempt to integrate them into a more British social and political structure. The San Pedro Maya took advantage of these British concerns, specifically requesting things like arms to use against the Pacificos in the mahogany-rich Yalbak Hills. Tension between the British Logging Company, the Icaiche Pacificos, and the San Pedro Maya continued to rise throughout the early 1860s as loggers claimed that traditional practices of subsistence milpa created through slash and burn agriculture, you used cut and burn the field in order to grow new crops. They claimed that this disrupted the mature stands of mahogany. In fact, subsistence agriculture allowed the Maya to maintain independence from British economic infrastructure, since they did not rely on the logging camps for wage labor, nor on those wages to purchase food. By maintaining traditional agricultural practices, the San Pedro Maya were able to use their money more freely within the colonial cash economy. However, this independence was severely threatened by when the Icaiche Pacificos raided and ransomed a British logging camp under Mexican authority in 1866. Though the logging camp ransom was eventually paid to the Icaiche, the event only heightened the suspicion of the British government against all Maya groups. Rumors of pro-Icaiche sentiments at San Pedro Siris, the foundations of which are suspect, led the British government to send a regiment to the capital at San Pedro Siris and to the nearby San Jose Yalbak in late 1866. While the Maya were able to hold off the British during the first attack, the British sent a second regiment in early 1867 that led to the burning of both San Pedro Siris and San Jose Yalbak. Now, if we're fast forwarding a bit, in the early 2000s, the San Pedro Maya project endeavored to tease out the relationship between the San Pedro Maya and the British during the 19th century. The project specifically sought to understand economic relationships between the two groups and how that reflected the negotiation of the San Pedro Maya identity and their ability to avoid assimilation into the British colonial system more fully. Project members, including two of our authors, scoured historical documents, interviewed village elders, and conducted survey and excavations at and around San Pedro Siris. This presentation focuses on the ceramics recovered from that work. We investigate paste, form, and surface treatment to highlight the relationship between Maya's subsistence economy, the imported British cash economy, and the nuanced integration of the two at San Pedro Siris. In the field, investigators sorted ceramics into three broad categories: ancient, local, and imported. Ancient ceramics generally encompass these heavily eroded pre-Columbian sherds, which were predominantly late Classic in date. These were found in much higher numbers than the other two categories. Imported ceramics referred to highly fired wares that were made abroad and then imported into the region. These included earthenwares, pearlwares, and willowwares, among others. They were produced at an industrial scale and were common across the world throughout the 19th century. Finally, the so-called local wares were low-fired earthenwares and were actually made in a similar fashion as the ancient ceramics, likely using traditional methods. And we infer them to be 19th century or 1800s due to the high frequency of co-occurrence. So due to the fact that they were found with historic wares in historic contexts, which we can date a little bit better. These were designated local to differentiate them from these long-distance imported wares. But one of the long-term goals of this project is to actually map the production of the local wares and determine whether they were made and produced in situ by San Pedro Maya potters or were imported from other traditional potting communities elsewhere in the peninsula, such as San Jose on Lake Patenitza or Tikul in the Pook Hills region. Given the persistence of subsistence agriculture and the resistance to assimilation by the Maya, one may assume that there were no imported materials found at San Pedro sites. However, many imported goods, including glass, cast iron, and glazed ceramics, were recovered from project excavations. Multiple types of white earthenware were recovered, including hand-painted flow blue vessels that you see here. Almost all glazed wares had either monochrome or polychrome surface decorations. This relative lack of plain whiteware, so purely white dishes, is distinctly contrasting to assemblages that you would find in the United States or in England at the same time. So clearly the San Pedro Maya were specifically seeking out decorated pieces when they purchased. Choices of form were also intentional, as almost all recovered sherds came from either bowls or dishes. These forms point to specific consumption practices, especially when we note that few glazed cups or plates were found in excavation. Out of 161 fragments of imported wares, pieces that were clearly bowls or dishes made up 63% by count, whereas plates only made up 3%. We see here a specific preference for traditional Maya foodways that emphasize soups and stews like stewed beans, rather than these required deep serving and eating vessels rather than the flat forms of the British table. As with many of the European goods recovered from San Pedro sites, we see the Maya purchasing colonial products to perpetuate local practices. Now, the non-glazed ceramic sherds, these local wares, were recovered from excavations at San Pedro Siris. Though these share similar paste characteristics to ancient examples and were likely fired using similar methods, they show considerably less surface erosion and again were found in those historic contexts. Analysis by the authors has created a typology of some of these well-preserved examples, which were exported to the University of Texas at San Antonio in 2019. The typology consists of 9 paste groups that vary by surface color, paste texture, and decoration. The surfaces were frequently gray or brown washed, though orange examples catch the eye against the more muted tones. Surface decoration usually takes the form of horizontal filleting or appliqued flanges, where we see a range of styles including fingernail and thumb impressions. Rare incised motifs are present as well, including one example with a design offset by white marl packed into concentric arcs, which you can see on your screen. The most relevant aspect of this collection, however, is the distributions of forms that were found. While imported wares consisted almost entirely of small bowls and dishes, as I mentioned, most of the local wares were large form vessels, including these thick-walled craters or basins, as well as deep incurving ollas or necklace jars. Where form could be determined, it's clear that large forms dominated the locally made assemblage, suggesting that these were used in preparation or even storage of food rather than in the individual consumption of food. This sharply contrasts the imported assemblage, and perhaps when we combine the two together, we finally start to see a clearer picture of the Maya table. So if we understand the San Pedro assemblage as a confluence of traditional food preparation and consumption using imported wares, we may start to understand the social, economic, and political relationships that were embedded in that very specific foodway. We may also compare them to the non-European foodways in and around British Honduras at the time. Cheek's investigations of Garifuna foodways, for example, trace a similar process of identity shaping. Garifuna individuals, in an effort to define their own cultural identity, embraced the British tea ritual. With employment as teachers, police officers, and other wage positions, Garifuna people used different strategies than Maya counterparts to integrate into British political and economic structures. The assemblage described by Cheek sits in contrast to our San Pedro Maya assemblage, with a significant difference in the number of imported plates and cups available. In Cheek's words, they were indeed setting an English table, using the symbolic power of the tea assemblage to form new identities in Central America and to shape the perception of this identity by outside colonial powers. The San Pedro Maya were also underscoring their identity and position alongside the British colonial structure, using a complex blend of imported and locally made goods. While there is a clear participation in the market economy, as noted by the presence of glass bottles, machetes, and glazed pottery, these products were incorporated fully into the independent subsistence economy that allowed the San Pedro Maya to resist simple assimilation into colonial structures. The Maya quite literally purchased colonial products to perpetuate local practices, pursuing ancestral foodways to remain self-sufficient in the face of encroaching wage labor logging camps and other colonial infrastructure. A clear symbol of this blending that I share with you here is this pipe stem impressed crater fragment found at San Pedro Siris, where a 19th century Maya potter used a purely British product, the white clay tobacco pipe, to create a new motif on a traditional form. Excavations at San Pedro Siris indicate a shift away from these large form cooking wares, with a large number of cast iron pots with interior lime coating recovered from the upper levels of excavation, perhaps suggesting a change in foodways in the region after the 1867 burning of of both San Pedro Siris and San Jose Yalbak. Land right claims by British logging companies also made ownership and milpa farming more challenging for the San Pedro Maya. Still, traditional foodways persisted, shaping in part the modern Belizean nation. Future work with this assemblage is promising. We hope to test the locally made pottery to confirm that these unslipped large forms were indeed produced in the Yalbak Hills. Alternatively, they may point to long-distance trade into the Petén or the Yucatan, regions we know were connected to the San Pedro sites historically. With that, I want to thank my co-authors, Drs. Jason Yeager and Minette Church, as well as our wonderful illustrator, Lauren. I want to also thank the projects and departments that made this work possible, and of course, thank Heritage Education Network Belize for hosting us and this wonderful conference for another year.